The unseen burdens of the city. It was a typical midweek afternoon in the heart of the bustling city, where the heat of the late spring sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the streets. The city was alive with the usual chaotic mix of sounds: the rumble of buses, the drone of passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional honk from a frustrated driver trying to navigate the endless gridlock. There was an urgency in the air, a quiet hum of routine as people moved swiftly through their day, each one caught up in the grind of life, too busy to notice the lives that swirled around them. But amidst the sea of anonymous faces and hurried footsteps, a story was about to unfold, one that would shake the very core of everyone who witnessed it. Shayla Williams, a young black woman of 28, stood at the crowded bus stop, her hand gently resting on her swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant, her pregnancy was unmistakable, her body radiating the natural beauty and vulnerability of impending motherhood. Her dark curls were pulled back into a loose bun, framing her tired yet resolute face. She had worked a long shift at the children's center where she was employed, spending her day nurturing the lively spirits of the kids in her care. Her job was her passion, working with children, guiding them, and giving them the attention and kindness they so desperately needed. But today had been exhausting. Every step felt heavier than the last, her back aching from hours on her feet, her ankles swollen from the weight of carrying her child. As she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, Shayla's mind wandered to her apartment, her small sanctuary where she could finally relax. Her partner, Malik, worked late shifts as a security guard, so the evenings were often quiet, just her and the baby, which was growing more active every day. She could feel the subtle kicks and flutters inside her now, as if her child sensed her exhaustion and was offering a gentle reminder that soon the hard part would be over. But beneath the surface of her calm demeanor, Shayla felt the anxiety that often crept up on her in moments like these. It wasn't just the physical strain of pregnancy, it was the emotional toll of balancing so many responsibilities. She had recently been promoted at the Children's Center, a promotion that filled her with both pride and trepidation. The added pressure at work, combined with the challenges of preparing for motherhood, sometimes felt overwhelming. How would she juggle it all? Would she be able to keep excelling at work while being the mother her child deserved? These questions lingered in her mind as she stood there, waiting for the bus. Her gaze drifted over the familiar faces at the stop, people she saw every day but knew nothing about. There was George, the elderly man who always carried a tattered paperback, completely absorbed in whatever mystery novel he was reading that week. His routine was predictable. He'd board the bus, find a seat near the front, and disappear into the world of his book until his stop arrived. Then there was Sarah, the overworked woman with a briefcase, always juggling her coffee cup and phone, her brow perpetually furrowed, as if she were mentally rehearsing for some high-stakes corporate meeting. Shayla admired Sarah's determination, though she had never spoken to her. But today, amidst the usual crowd, there was an unfamiliar face that stood out. Jared Thompson, a middle-aged white man dressed in a sharp business suit, stood rigidly at the edge of the platform, his body language exuding impatience and irritation. His face, drawn and stern, was fixed in a permanent scowl as he checked his watch for what seemed like the 100th time, each glance followed by a muttered curse. His whole demeanor screamed of frustration, like a man who had grown accustomed to controlling everything in his life, but was now faced with a situation beyond his grasp. Shayla barely noticed him at first, though his native energy was hard to ignore. Jared's presence at the bus stop was an anomaly. He was a successful executive, the type of man who usually had no need for public transportation. But today was different. His luxury car had broken down, leaving him stranded and forced to take the bus like everyone else. For Jared, this was not just an inconvenience, it was an indignity. He felt like a king cast out of his palace, forced to mingle with the commoners. His entire day had been a disaster. First, the argument with his ex-wife over alimony, then the meeting he'd missed because of the car trouble, And now this. Public transportation. The very idea was beneath him, and the mere thought of boarding the crowded, noisy bus filled him with disgust. As he stood there, seething in silence, his mind raced through the series of unfortunate events that had led him here. It wasn't just the car. His entire life had been spiraling out of control lately. The divorce had been a bitter one, leaving him not only emotionally raw but also financially drained. His ex-wife had taken half of everything, and the constant demands for more money had become a source of deep resentment. Jared had always prided himself on being in control, at work, in his relationships, in life. But lately that control had slipped through his fingers like sand, and today felt like the final insult. The bus arrived with a screech of brakes, and the crowd stirred as the doors opened. Jared, determined to reclaim some semblance of control, elbowed his way to the front, pushing past George, who stumbled slightly but caught himself on the railing. Linda, a middle-aged woman who had been quietly observing from a distance, shot Jared a disapproving look as she helped steady the elderly man. Linda had seen men like Jared before, men who thought the world owed them something, men who pushed their way to the top without a second thought for those they trampled along the way. Shayla watched as the passengers began to board, her heart sinking as she realized that seats were filling up quickly. Her feet throbbed painfully, and the thought of standing for the entire ride home filled her with dread. She made her way to the bus slowly, carefully navigating the crowd. As she stepped on board, she scanned the rows of seats, searching for a place to sit. Her eyes landed on Jared, who had claimed a window seat near the front. The aisle seat next to him was empty, but his briefcase was strategically placed on it, a silent declaration that he had no intention of sharing his space. Gathering her courage, Shayla approached him, her voice soft but steady. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes meeting his briefly. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Jared didn't even bother to look up from his phone. His fingers continued to tap furiously on the screen, and for a moment, Shayla wondered if he had heard her at all. Then, without lifting his gaze, he muttered, "No, find somewhere else." The words hit Shayla like a slap, sharp and unexpected. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stood there, momentarily stunned by the blatant rudeness of his refusal. For a moment, she considered saying something, pointing out the obvious fact that she was pregnant and in need of a seat. But as she looked at Jared, at the cold indifference in his eyes, she realized it would be futile. There was no reasoning with someone like him. With a sigh, Shayla turned away, moving to stand in the aisle. The bus jolted forward, throwing her slightly off balance, but she caught herself, one hand protectively cradling her belly as she braced for the long, uncomfortable ride home. A lesson in humanity. The bus rattled on, its engine grumbling as it lumbered through the busy streets. Inside, the atmosphere had grown even more uncomfortable. Jared's refusal to give up his seat for Shayla had caught the attention of a few nearby passengers, but most had quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. No one wanted to get involved, and the unspoken tension between them hung in the air like a fog. Shayla stood gripping a pole in the middle of the aisle, her back aching and her feet throbbing. Her mind reeled, trying to process what had just happened. The sharp sting of Jared's racist comment lingered in her thoughts, a bitter echo of cruelty that she'd experienced far too many times in her life. But this time, with her pregnancy making her more vulnerable, the blow felt harder. Her hand instinctively cradled her belly as she took a few calming breaths, hoping the weight of the day wouldn't push her to tears. As the bus lurched forward, Shayla glanced around at the passengers seated nearby. Most of them were avoiding her gaze, staring out the windows or down at their phones, desperate to ignore the situation unfolding before them. A few gave her sympathetic looks, but none seemed willing to do anything. She felt isolated, standing alone in the crowded bus, the world pressing in around her. Shayla wasn't one to back down easily, but she had learned to pick her battles carefully. Arguing with someone like Jared, a man so consumed by his own entitlement and bitterness, would only escalate things. And at 7 months pregnant, The last thing she needed was more stress. As the bus bumped along its route, Shayla tried to shift her focus away from the confrontation. She thought of her unborn child and the life she was trying to build for the two of them. The future seemed uncertain and daunting at times, but she had always prided herself on her resilience. Her job at the Children's Center gave her a sense of purpose and a connection to her community, but it wasn't easy balancing the demands of her work and preparing for the new responsibilities of motherhood. Yet, even with all the challenges ahead, Shayla knew she had the strength to get through it. She had faced worse before and had always come out stronger on the other side. Today would be no different, she told herself, though the gnawing ache in her back made that conviction a little harder to hold on to. Suddenly, a quiet voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me," a middle-aged woman said softly, standing up from her seat near the front of the bus. "You can sit here." Shayla looked up, surprised. It was Linda, the woman she had noticed at the bus stop earlier. Linda's warm smile was full of kindness, and her eyes crinkled at the corners as she gestured to her now empty seat. Shayla hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to accept. She didn't want to be a burden, and part of her pride made her reluctant to take the offer. But the relief in her tired feet and aching back made the decision for her. "Thank you," Shayla said, her voice quiet but filled with gratitude. She made her way over to the seat and sank down with a sigh, the weight of exhaustion easing slightly as she finally rested. The tension in her shoulders began to unwind, and she shot Linda a small, appreciative smile as the woman returned to her standing position. Jared, still glaring at his phone, either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge what had just happened. He was too wrapped up in his own bitterness, too insulated by his self-importance to see the simple act of humanity that had just taken place beside him. In his world, people like Shayla didn't matter. They were obstacles, not equals. The bus continued its journey, rumbling through the city streets, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. Linda's small act of kindness had rippled through the bus, and a few of the passengers who had previously averted their eyes now looked at Shayla and Linda with quiet admiration. It was a reminder, however subtle, that decency still existed, even in the face of prejudice. However, the story wasn't over. Unbeknownst to Jared, someone had been watching his behavior closely. Near the back of the bus, a man sat silently observing the entire scene. He was an older gentleman, dressed in simple clothes, with a worn leather notebook resting on his lap. His sharp eyes had followed Jared's every move from the moment he boarded the bus, and he had taken particular notice of how the man treated Shayla. His name was Samuel, and while he appeared unassuming, there was a quiet authority about him. Samuel was well known in the community, though not in the way Jared or the other passengers would recognize. He had spent most of his life fighting for justice and equality, using his voice to lift up those who had been silenced by systems of oppression and prejudice. Though retired now, Samuel hadn't lost his passion for the cause or his sharp sense of right and wrong. As he watched Jared, a man who represented everything Samuel had spent his life opposing, a familiar feeling of indignation stirred within him. But Samuel wasn't a man of quick tempers or impulsive reactions. No, he had learned long ago that real change came through action, not words, and that the best way to counter ignorance and hate was by exposing it for the world to see. With a calm, deliberate motion, Samuel opened his notebook and began writing. His fingers, though aged, moved swiftly across the page, capturing the details of the encounter. The racism, the entitlement, and most importantly, the quiet courage and dignity Shayla had shown in the face of it. His notes were meticulous, each word chosen with care, as if he were crafting a story not just for himself, but for others to learn from. Samuel had always believed that stories had the power to change hearts and minds, and this was a story worth telling. As he wrote, he thought of the countless other times he had witnessed or experienced similar acts of injustice. The faces change, but the underlying issues remain the same. Prejudice, entitlement, cruelty, they were old foes that had long plagued society. but kindness, compassion, and resilience. They were the forces that could overcome them. As the bus neared his stop, Samuel closed his notebook and stood up. He cast one final look at Jared, who was still engrossed in his phone, oblivious to the world around him. Samuel's gaze lingered for a moment before he turned and walked toward the front of the bus. Before he exited, Samuel paused beside Shayla. She looked up at him, curious but too tired to say much. "Don't let people like him get to you," Samuel said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "You've got a strength in you that he'll never understand." Shayla blinked, taken aback by the sudden words of encouragement from a stranger. But as she met Samuel's kind, knowing eyes, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She nodded, unable to find the right words to respond, but grateful all the same. With a small nod, Samuel stepped off the bus, leaving Shayla to reflect on his words. The bus doors closed behind him with a hiss, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, continuing its journey through the city. Inside, Shayla sat in her seat, the weight of the day still heavy on her. But something had shifted. Samuel's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that she wasn't alone, that there were people in the world who saw her, who understood her struggle, and who believed in her strength. As the bus rolled on, Shayla looked out the window, watching the city blur by. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she felt a renewed sense of determination. No matter how many Jareds she encountered, she would rise above them. She would stand tall for herself, for her baby, and for the future she was building. A future where kindness and courage would always triumph over hate. And somewhere, beyond the confines of the bus, Samuel knew that the story he had just witnessed would one day reach the ears and hearts of many, sparking a change far greater than any confrontation ever could. But for now, the bus ride continued, and with it, the quiet, powerful fight for dignity and respect endured. The ripple effect. Shayla spent the rest of her bus ride in quiet reflection. Her mind circled back to Samuel's words, lingering on the kindness he'd shown, which stood in stark contrast to the cruelty she had faced earlier. It was amazing how a single gesture could lift someone from the brink of despair. Shayla didn't know Samuel, but his quiet, steadfast encouragement had ignited something within her, a reminder that no matter how harsh the world could be, there were still people who cared, people who would stand with her in the face of injustice. The bus rumbled toward her stop, and as it approached, she gathered her things, her body still heavy with exhaustion, but her heart lighter. She stood up, gripping the strap of her bag, and waited as the bus slowed to a stop. As the doors slid open, Shayla stepped off, feeling the cool breeze hit her face. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, as if it could cleanse away the remnants of the ugly encounter. Behind her, the bus rolled away, disappearing into the distance, carrying Jared and the rest of the passengers with it. As she walked down the familiar street toward her apartment, her thoughts wandered back to her day at the children's center. The kids had been their usual lively selves, full of energy and curiosity, and despite her weariness, the memories brought a small smile to her lips. The center was her sanctuary, a place where she could make a difference. Every day, she worked with kids from all walks of life, many of them from tough neighborhoods, some of them struggling with problems far bigger than their young hearts should have to bear. And yet they came in with smiles, eager to learn, to play, to be seen and heard. Shayla found solace in the fact that her work mattered. She knew she was shaping young minds, giving them the tools and love they needed to grow into strong, confident people. But today had been a stark reminder of just how difficult the world could be. The bus ride wasn't just a random occurrence. It was a reflection of a society that still held on to deep-seated prejudice and ignorance. Jared's behavior, while despicable, wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern that Shayla had seen play out time and again. And while she had learned to navigate these waters, shielding herself from the worst of it, she couldn't help but worry about the world her child was about to enter. As she reached the steps of her apartment building, Shayla paused, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. She was about to unlock the door when her phone buzzed in her bag. She fumbled for it, half expecting another reminder for a doctor's appointment or a message from a coworker, but when she glanced at the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was a notification from one of her social media accounts, a tag from someone she didn't recognize. Curiosity piqued. She opened the app and saw that it was a post from someone named Elise. The post featured a grainy photo of the bus she had just been on, along with a caption that made Shayla's breath catch in her throat. "I was on the bus today, and I witnessed something that broke my heart and inspired me all at once. A pregnant woman, standing on the bus, was denied a seat by a man who refused to acknowledge her humanity. But another woman stood up, offering her seat, and a kind older man gave her words of support that I'll never forget. We talk about how divided our world is, but there are still people who show up for each other. We need more of that. More kindness, more courage." Shayla's heart raced as she scrolled through the comments beneath the post. Dozens of people had already chimed in, expressing outrage at Jared's behavior and admiration for the simple acts of kindness that had followed. It was as though the moment she thought had passed in obscurity was now gaining a life of its own. People were sharing the post, adding their own stories of injustice and resilience, and the conversation was growing. She couldn't believe it. What had felt like just another painful incident in her daily life was now sparking a larger dialogue. And at the center of it was her and the kindness of strangers who had refused to let hate win. A sense of validation washed over her. For so long, she had felt like she was fighting these battles alone, enduring the microaggressions and overt racism in silence, knowing that the world wouldn't always take notice. But here, people were noticing. They were talking about it, and for the first time in a long time, Shayla felt seen, not just as a victim, but as someone who had stood strong in the face of adversity. As she continued to scroll, she came across another comment that gave her pause. It was from someone named Carla, and it was written with a sense of urgency. "This needs to be reported. This is why we need public accountability. I work with a local civil rights group, and we've been trying to get the city transit system to implement better policies for situations like this. This is unacceptable." Shayla stared at the comment for a long moment. She hadn't thought about taking any formal action after the incident. She had just wanted to move on with her day, to let the frustration fade away. But now, seeing the post and the responses, she realized that maybe this was bigger than just her. Maybe this was a chance to make a real difference, not just for herself, but for others who had been in her position. After a moment's hesitation, Shayla responded to Carla's comment, sharing a few more details about what had happened on the bus. She didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time, she felt empowered to speak up, to be part of the change he wanted to see. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. The post continued to gain traction, and soon, local media outlets picked up the story. Reporters reached out to Shayla, wanting to hear her side of the incident, and she found herself thrust into the spotlight in a way she never expected. It was overwhelming at times, but Shayla knew this was an opportunity to amplify her voice, and the voices of countless others who had endured similar injustices. With Carla's help, she filed a formal complaint with the City Transit Authority, detailing not just her own experience, but also the broader issue of discrimination and inequality on public transportation. Carla's civil rights group offered support, helping Shayla navigate the process and bringing attention to the systemic problems that had allowed people like Jared to act with impunity. The response was more than Shayla could have hoped for. Within weeks, the city announced a review of its transit policies, pledging to implement new measures aimed at preventing incidents of harassment and ensuring that vulnerable passengers, especially pregnant women, the elderly, and people with disabilities, would have better access to seating and assistance. It was a small but significant victory, one that Shayla never imagined she would be a part of. And through it all, Shayla kept thinking about Samuel. She wished she could thank him properly, to let him know that his words had not only lifted her spirit, but had set off a chain of events that led to real change. His quiet strength had given her the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to believe that her voice mattered. One evening, after a long day of work at the Children's Center, Shayla sat down with her phone and opened her social media account. She composed a simple post, tagging the local news outlet that had covered her story. "To the man who gave me strength on the bus that day, thank you. Your kindness didn't just help me get through a tough moment. It helped change the way our city treats people like me. I'll never forget your words." As she hit post, Shayla felt a deep sense of closure. She didn't know if Samuel would ever see her message, but she hoped he would know that his small act of compassion had rippled out into the world in ways neither of them could have imagined. And as her baby kicked gently in her belly, Shayla smiled, knowing that they would enter a world that was just a little bit better than it had been before. A world where kindness could still make a difference, one bus ride at a time. Seeds of change. Weeks had passed since Shayla's life had unexpectedly taken center stage. What had started as a regular bus ride had grown into a public movement, a symbol of everyday courage in the face of casual injustice. She had become something of a local figure, an accidental advocate for change, though she still thought of herself as just another working woman, doing her best to survive each day. The city's new policies on public transportation had garnered praise from activists and citizens alike. The transit system began rolling out posters encouraging passengers to stand up for dignity, urging everyone to be more aware of the needs of others. Shayla smiled whenever she saw one of those posters, knowing that she had played a part in bringing that change to life. It was a small victory, but it was something tangible, a sign that even ordinary people could make a difference when they chose not to remain silent. But the story didn't end there. Shayla's life had returned to some semblance of normalcy, though she found herself busier than ever. Between her work at the Children's Center, preparations for her baby's arrival, and the growing number of invitations to speak at community events and civil rights gatherings, her days were packed. Yet every time she felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in, she remembered the reason behind it all, the belief that she was helping to build a better world for her child. One Saturday morning, as she sat in the kitchen sipping tea, her phone buzzed with a text message from Carla, the civil rights advocate who had helped her file the complaint with the city. "Carla, hey Shayla, big news. There's a forum happening next month on public transportation and equity. They want you to be one of the panelists. Would you be interested?" Shayla stared at the message, a sense of disbelief washing over her. A panelist. Her. She had never considered herself a public speaker. She'd always been the one who worked quietly in the background, making a difference in the lives of children, not standing in front of crowds. But after a moment of hesitation, she found herself typing back a response. "Shayla, I'd love to. Let me know the details." Her heart raced as she sent the message, a mix of excitement and nerves swirling inside her. She knew this was important, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized, silenced, or treated as invisible. This was her chance to speak on behalf of those who couldn't, to share her story, and push for even deeper changes. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Shayla spent her evenings reading up on the history of public transportation, systemic inequality, and civil rights movements. She felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that when she spoke, she would be representing more than just herself. She was carrying the stories of countless others who had faced injustice, and she wanted to do them justice. The day of the forum arrived, and Shayla found herself standing backstage at a large auditorium, peeking out at the rows of seats slowly filling up with attendees. The event had drawn a larger crowd than she had expected. Local politicians, civil rights leaders, transit officials, and members of the public had all gathered to discuss how the city could move forward in creating a more inclusive and just transportation system. Shayla smoothed the front of her dress, feeling the familiar flutter of her baby's kicks beneath her hand. A soft smile touched her lips. This child had been with her through it all, from the moment on the bus to this very stage. She felt as though they were walking this path together, and that thought gave her a sense of peace. Carla appeared beside her, giving her a reassuring nod. "You're going to be great," she said. "Just speak from the heart." Shayla nodded, taking a deep breath as her name was announced over the microphone. The sound of polite applause filled the air as she stepped out onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked to the podium, the bright lights overhead making it hard to see the faces in the crowd. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought of Samuel, of the way he had stood up for her in that small, quiet moment, and she knew that she could do this. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "My name is Shayla, and I'm here today to talk about something that should matter to all of us. Dignity. The dignity we all deserve when we step onto a bus, walk into a room, or simply exist in this world." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The auditorium had fallen silent, all eyes on her. "A few months ago, I had an experience that changed my life. I was on a bus, heavily pregnant, exhausted from a long day of work. A man refused to give up his seat for me. He wouldn't even acknowledge my presence. In that moment, I felt invisible, less than human. But then, someone else stood up for me. A kind man named Samuel, who didn't know me anything, but who saw me and spoke up when no one else would." Shayla's voice grew stronger as she continued. "That small act of kindness sparked something bigger. It made me realize that we all have the power to make a difference, even in the smallest moments, and it reminded me that silence in the face of injustice is complicity." The crowd listened intently, some nodding along, others with looks of deep concentration. "I'm not here to tell you that one policy change will solve all our problems," she said, her tone resolute. "But what I do know is that every step toward equity matters. Every time we choose kindness over apathy, every time we stand up for someone who's being mistreated, we plant a seed of change." Shayla went on to share not just her personal experience, but the broader issues facing marginalized communities on public transportation. She talked about the need for policies that protected the most vulnerable passengers, the importance of training transit workers to recognize and address discrimination, and the power of community in holding public institutions accountable. As she spoke, she felt a sense of empowerment she had never known before. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story of a movement, one that was growing with every person who decided to take a stand. By the time she finished, the room was filled with applause, and Shayla stepped back from the podium, her heart full. After the event, several people approached her, thanking her for her courage and offering their support for the work ahead. But it was a familiar face that caught her eye as the crowd began to thin. Samuel stood near the exit, his hands in his pockets, a warm smile on his face. Shayla's breath caught in her throat as she made her way over to him, her mind racing. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, her voice soft. Samuel chuckled. "I didn't think I'd become part of such a big story," he replied. "But I'm glad I could help, even in a small way." Shayla smiled, her heart full of gratitude. "You did more than help. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that people still care." And that made all the difference. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the weight of the world feeling a little lighter in their shared presence. "I'm proud of you, Shayla," Samuel said quietly. "You took something small and turned it into something that's making a real difference." Shayla nodded, her eyes misting over. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they said their goodbyes, Shayla felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. But she knew that she wasn't alone in it. And with people like Samuel, Carla, and countless others standing beside her, she believed that real, lasting change was possible. And as she walked out into the cool evening air, her hand resting gently on her belly, Shayla knew one thing for certain. She would continue to fight for a world where her child, and every child, could grow up in a place where kindness, justice, and equality weren't just ideals, but realities. Building bridges. Shayla's life after the forum didn't slow down as she might have hoped. In fact, It sped up in ways she never could have imagined. Her story had inspired a ripple effect across the city, and invitations continued to pour in, from schools, community groups, and even media outlets. Every event felt like a new opportunity to amplify voices that had long been ignored. But along with the growing attention came pressure, too. Pressure to live up to her new role as an advocate for change. The forum's impact extended beyond just words and applause. Within a few weeks, the City Council announced plans for a new program aimed at addressing inequities in public transportation. It wasn't just a public relations stunt. They had committed to reallocating funds to retrofit older buses with accessibility features and increase the availability of free or reduced fare rides for low-income passengers. They also began rolling out diversity and sensitivity training for all transit workers, ensuring they understood the challenges faced by vulnerable riders. Shayla had been invited to sit in on the planning meetings. She hadn't expected to play a direct role in city policy, but as one of the most visible voices in the movement, her presence was important. At the first meeting, she found herself seated at a long conference table across from transit executives, city officials, and community leaders. "I never thought I'd be in a room like this," Shayla whispered to Carla, who was seated next to her. Carla smiled. "You belong here, Shayla. Your experience is the reason we're all here." The meeting started with formalities, discussions about logistics, funding, and policy language. Shayla listened intently, taking notes and absorbing the layers of bureaucracy that came with change. But as the conversation shifted toward the personal experiences of riders, Shayla knew it was her time to speak. "I appreciate everything you're doing," Shayla began, her voice strong and clear. "But it's not just about making buses more accessible or offering more affordable rides. It's about respect. I think one of the most important things we can do is teach people, both drivers and riders, that public transportation is for everyone, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." Heads nodded around the room. Shayla could feel the weight of her words landing, and she pressed on. "People in positions of power sometimes forget what it's like to feel powerless," she continued. "When I was on that bus, it wasn't just about needing a seat. It was about being seen. And that's something a lot of people, especially those who've been marginalized their whole lives, don't get. This isn't just a transportation issue. It's a human issue." By the time the meeting wrapped up, Shayla had made her mark. She left the room feeling lighter, more hopeful. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and she had become a catalyst for that change. A few weeks later, Shayla found herself in a much smaller room, sitting on the edge of a chair at her obstetrician's office. Her pregnancy had progressed smoothly so far, but the weight of everything she was balancing, her work, her advocacy, her growing visibility, sometimes felt overwhelming. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the steady rhythm of her baby's movements. Dr. Patel entered the room with a warm smile. "Shayla, how are we feeling today?" she asked as she reviewed the chart. "A little tired," Shayla admitted, "but mostly good." Dr. Patel nodded. "That's to be expected. You're doing a lot. But I see no issues with the pregnancy itself. Baby's heart rate is strong, and everything looks great." Shayla sighed with relief. Despite the chaos of her life, the health of her baby remained her top priority. Dr. Patel looked up from the chart. "You know, Shayla, I've been following your story in the news," she said. "What you're doing is incredible. It takes real strength to stand up and push for change like that." Shayla smiled, though she felt a flicker of self-doubt. "I'm just trying to do what's right. It still feels surreal, to be honest." "Well, you're inspiring a lot of people," Dr. Patel said kindly. "Just make sure you're taking care of yourself, too. You can't pour from an empty cup." Shayla nodded, appreciating the advice but knowing it would be hard to follow. The demands on her time weren't likely to lessen anytime soon. As the weeks turned into months, Shayla's life became a delicate balancing act between preparing for her baby's arrival and maintaining her role as a public advocate. Every day, she received emails from people thanking her for sharing her story. many of them recounting their own experiences with injustice. Some were heartwarming, others heartbreaking. They were stories from single mothers, immigrants, disabled veterans, and elderly citizens who had all felt the sting of being overlooked or mistreated in public spaces. One email, in particular, caught her attention. It was from a woman named Maria, who had faced discrimination at her job as a waitress due to her accent and immigrant status. Maria wrote about how she had felt invisible, like a ghost moving through the world, until she heard Shayla's story on the news. "I used to think that no one cared about people like me," Maria had written. "But you made me believe that maybe, just maybe, my story matters too. Thank you for giving people like me hope." Shayla sat with that email for a long time, tears welling in her eyes. She had never intended to become anyone's role model, but now she realized that's exactly what she had become. Her fight wasn't just for better buses or kinder passengers. It was for people like Maria, people who had been made to feel small their entire lives. And as long as there were people like Maria, Shayla knew she couldn't stop. One afternoon, as she sat in her small office at the Children's Center, Shayla received a phone call that would change everything once again. It was from a producer at a national television network who had heard about her story and wanted to feature her on a primetime special about ordinary people creating extraordinary change. "We think your story is exactly what America needs to hear right now," the producer said. "We're putting together a segment called the Everyday Heroes Project, and we'd love for you to be part of it." Shayla's heart skipped a beat. National television. It felt like a far cry from the quiet life she had lived just months ago. But as she sat there, considering the offer, she thought about all the stories she had heard from people like Maria. Stories of pain, resilience, and hope. This was an opportunity to give them a voice, to shine a light on the everyday struggles that so often went unnoticed. "I'd be honored," Shayla finally said, her voice steady with resolve. The producer went on to explain the details of the shoot, the interviews, and the timeline. As she hung up the phone, Shayla realized just how much her life had shifted. What had once been a simple act of standing up for herself had evolved into something so much bigger. Later that night, as she lay in bed, her hand resting on her swollen belly, she whispered to the life growing inside her, "I'm doing this for you, baby. For a world where you'll never have to feel invisible, where you'll be seen and heard and valued for who you are." Tears welled in her eyes as she thought of the future, both her own and the world she was helping to shape. She wasn't naive enough to think that the fight for justice was over, or that one television special could solve systemic problems. But she knew that stories had power, and as long as people like her were willing to tell them, there was hope for a better tomorrow. The day of the television special arrived, and Shayla found herself sitting in a bright studio under blinding lights, a microphone clipped to her lapel. The host, a kind woman with a gentle smile, sat across from her, ready to guide her through the interview. "Shayla," the host began, "your story has touched the hearts of so many people. You've become a symbol of everyday courage. How does that feel?" Shayla smiled, though there was a modest humility behind her eyes. "It feels overwhelming, honestly. I never set out to be a symbol. I just wanted to stand up for myself, for my baby, and for everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible. But if my story can help others find their voice, then I'm grateful." The interview continued, touching on Shayla's experiences, the changes in the city's transit system, and the broader message of equality and respect. As the cameras rolled, Shayla spoke not just for herself, but for the countless people whose stories have been overlooked for too long. When the interview ended, the host leaned in and said, "Thank you for sharing your truth with us. I believe you've started something powerful." Shayla smiled, her heart full. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would keep fighting for a world where no one was invisible. And with every new voice that joined the movement, she believed that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The echoes of change. The television special catapulted Shayla's story to a national audience. Almost overnight, Her inbox flooded with messages of support, encouragement, and solidarity from people across the country. It wasn't just from individuals who had faced injustice. It was from teachers, social workers, activists, and even elected officials who had been moved by her quiet, unyielding strength. Shayla's face, once just a part of the city's tapestry, was now the face of an entire movement. But with newfound recognition came unexpected challenges. Shayla's phone buzzed constantly with invitations to speak at conferences, podcasts, and events. Her schedule, already packed with community work and preparations for her baby's arrival, became a delicate juggling act. She was also fielding media inquiries and interview requests from outlets she had never imagined would know her name. Everyone wanted a piece of her story, and though she appreciated the attention, it weighed heavily on her. "You've got to pace yourself, Shayla," Carla said one evening as they sat in Shayla's living room, poring over her emails. "You can't do everything. You'll burn out." Shayla sighed, glancing at the long list of unread messages. "I know. It's just, how do I say no when I know these platforms could make a difference? When people are finally listening." Carla nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. But you've also got to think about your health, especially with the baby coming. And remember, you're not alone in this fight. You've started something big, but it doesn't all rest on your shoulders." Shayla leaned back into the couch, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. She felt the gentle flutter of movement beneath her palm and smiled. Carla was right, of course. It wasn't just about her anymore. The movement had taken on a life of its own. And now, there were others stepping up, adding their voices to the chorus she had sparked. A few days later, Shayla received a surprising message from someone she had never expected to hear from, Arthur Bennett, the bus driver from that fateful day. His message was brief and formal, simply asking if they could meet. Shayla's initial reaction was hesitation. What could he possibly have to say? But after discussing it with Carla and mulling it over for a while, she decided that meeting with him might provide some closure. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the bus depot where Arthur worked. Shayla arrived early, nerves buzzing in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would he apologize? Would he try to justify his actions? Arthur arrived a few minutes later, looking older than she remembered, though perhaps it was the weight of the situation that added lines to his face. He approached the table with a tentative nod, clearly unsure of how to begin. Shayla offered a small, polite smile as he sat down across from her. For a moment, they sat in awkward silence, the hum of the cafe around them filling the space between words. Finally, Arthur spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but steady. "I know I treated you wrong that day, and I've been thinking about it ever since." Shayla listened, her expression calm, but her heart racing. "I've been driving buses for over 20 years, Arthur continued, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "And I've seen a lot of things, some good, some bad. That day, I was frustrated, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I didn't see you for who you are. I saw you as a problem, and I regret that. Deeply." Shayla took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her own cup. "I appreciate you saying that, Arthur. I do. But it wasn't just about that one day. It's bigger than that." Arthur nodded. "I know. After everything that's happened since, I've realized that. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'm trying to change. I'm going through the training the city's implemented, and I'm talking to my coworkers about it. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." His words, though imperfect, felt genuine. Shayla saw the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of a man trying to right a wrong, not just to her, but to himself. She had spent so much time fighting for change that seeing it in someone like Arthur, in such a personal way, stirred something in her. It reminded her that change wasn't always sweeping. Sometimes it was small and slow, like water carving out a river over time. "I'm glad to hear that, Arthur," Shayla said softly. "It's not easy to admit when we've done something wrong. But the fact that you're trying to do better, that matters." They talked for a while longer, about the changes in the transit system, the way the public had responded to Shayla's story, and the long road ahead for meaningful reform. By the time they parted ways, Shayla felt a strange sense of closure. She hadn't needed an apology to move forward, but receiving one had helped her put that chapter of her life behind her. As the months passed, Shayla found herself settling into a new rhythm. Her pregnancy was nearing its final stages, and the anticipation of motherhood filled her days with a sense of quiet excitement. The work she had started continued to grow, but she had learned to delegate, trusting others to carry the torch in areas where she couldn't be present. The city's transit reforms had begun to take effect, and though progress was slow, it was steady. One evening, as Shayla and Carla sat on the couch, sorting through baby clothes and discussing the upcoming birth, Shayla's phone buzzed with an email notification. She glanced at it, her eyes widening as she read the subject line. Human Rights Award nomination. "Carla, you're not going to believe this," Shayla said, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. "I've been nominated for a Human Rights Award." Carla's eyes lit up. "What? That's amazing, Shayla. You deserve it." Shayla shook her head, still processing the news. "I never expected something like this. I just wanted to speak up for what was right." Carla leaned over and squeezed Shayla's hand. "And that's exactly why you deserve it. You didn't do any of this for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. That's what makes you special." The award ceremony was scheduled for after Shayla's due date, giving her plenty of time to prepare, mentally and emotionally. The nomination felt surreal, like a culmination of everything she had fought for, but also a reminder that her work was far from over. Winning or losing wasn't what mattered to her. What mattered was that the issues she had raised, the stories she had shared, were finally being recognized on a larger scale. The day of the ceremony came much sooner than Shayla expected. She stood backstage, her heart pounding as she listened to the names of the other nominees being called. Each one was a giant in their own right, activists who had dedicated their lives to fighting for justice in various ways. Shayla felt small by comparison, but she reminded herself that change came in many forms, and that her contribution, no matter how small it seemed, had made an impact. When her name was finally called, Shayla took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The applause was deafening, but all she could think about were the faces of the people she had met along her journey. Maria, the woman who had written to her about workplace discrimination. The elderly passengers who had thanked her for making their voices heard, and even Arthur, who had taken steps toward becoming a better man. As she approached the podium, Shayla spoke from the heart. "I'm honored to stand here tonight, but this recognition isn't just for me. It's for every person who has ever felt invisible, for every story that's been silenced, for every fight that's been fought in the shadows. My journey began with a single moment of standing up for myself, but it grew into something much larger because so many of you stood with me. This award belongs to all of us, those who believe in the power of our voices and the power of change." The room erupted in applause once again, but Shayla felt a deep sense of calm. She had come so far from the woman who had simply wanted a seat on the bus. Now she was a mother-to-be, an advocate, and a symbol of what could happen when one voice refused to be silenced. As she left the stage, her hand resting on her belly, she whispered to her unborn child, "We did it, little one, and this is just the beginning."